The package arrived on a Tuesday morning in May of 1878, wrapped in brown paper that had traveled all the way from Boston to Stockton, California. And Harriet Norton knew, before she even opened it, that her old life was about to collide with her new one in the worst possible way. She stood in the back room of Morrison's general store where she worked, holding the parcel with trembling fingers, recognizing her sister's handwriting on the label, and felt the familiar twist of homesickness and shame war in her chest. For 6 months now, she had been speaking in what she hoped passed for a neutral American accent, carefully flattening the thick Irish brogue that marked her as fresh off the boat, as someone to be mocked and dismissed in this dusty California town where prejudice ran as deep as the San Joaquin River. The bell above the shop door chimed, and Harriet quickly tucked the package under the counter, smoothing her apron and forcing her face into the pleasant, helpful expression that Mr. Morrison expected of his employees. She walked back into the main store, preparing her careful, practiced words in her mind before she spoke. "Good morning. How may I help you today?" The words came out flat, generic, scrubbed clean of the rolling rhythm that had defined her speech for the first 20 years of her life. The customer was Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, the banker's wife, a woman whose pinched face seemed permanently arranged in an expression of disapproval. "I need 3 yards of the blue calico and a spool of white thread, and do be careful with the measuring. Last time that other girl shorted me half an inch. Of course, madam, I will be very precise." Harriet moved to the fabric bolts, her movements efficient despite the weight of exhaustion that seemed to press down on her shoulders lately. Every word was a conscious effort. Every sentence required thought and adjustment. Sometimes she dreamed in her real voice and woke up relieved that no one could hear her sleeping thoughts. She had come to Stockton after her parents died in the winter of 1877, tuberculosis taking them within weeks of each other in the cramped tenement they had shared in Boston. Her older sister Margaret had married and moved to New York, and her younger brother Thomas had signed on with a fishing crew bound for the Atlantic. Harriet had wanted something different, somewhere she could be someone new, somewhere the signs in shop windows did not read, "No Irish need apply." California had seemed like a land of possibility when she read about it in the newspapers, a place where anyone could start fresh. The reality had been harsher than her imaginings. She had arrived in Stockton with $30 to her name and quickly discovered that even in California, the Irish were viewed with suspicion and contempt. After a week of fruitless job searching, she had overheard 2 women talking in a boarding house parlor about how the Irish were lazy, drunk, and barely better than animals. That night, alone in her small rented room, Harriet had stood in front of her washstand mirror and practiced speaking differently. She listened to how the American-born women talked, how they shaped their vowels and where they placed their emphasis, and she had worked until her throat was sore to reproduce those sounds. It had gotten her the job at Morrison's. It had gotten her a place to live. It had gotten her grudging acceptance from the townspeople. But it had also carved out something hollow inside her, a space where her real self used to be. Mrs. Pritchard examined the cut fabric with a critical eye, holding it up to the light streaming through the front windows. "I suppose this will do, though I must say the quality of goods available in this town leaves much to be desired." "I am sorry to hear that, madam." Harriet wrapped the purchase in paper and tied it with string, her fingers moving through the familiar motions. "That will be $1.40. The transaction completed, Mrs. Pritchard swept out of the store with her package, leaving Harriet alone once more. She returned to the back room and retrieved her sister's parcel, carefully opening it to find a letter, a small fruitcake wrapped in cloth, and a pressed flower from their mother's garden. The letter was full of Margaret's news about her growing family, her husband's promotion, the baby due in the fall. At the end, Margaret had written, "I miss hearing your voice, Hattie. Your letters sound so formal now. Are you well? Are you happy? Please come visit when you can. I want to see my sister again." Harriet folded the letter and pressed it to her chest, allowing herself one moment of weakness. Then she tucked it into her reticule, wrapped the fruitcake back up to take home to her boarding house, and returned to the front of the store. Mr. Morrison would be back from the bank soon, and she needed to finish inventorying the new shipment of tinned goods that had arrived yesterday. The afternoon passed slowly, punctuated by occasional customers and the tick of the large clock on the wall behind the counter. Harriet was arranging a display of sewing notions when the bell chimed again, and she looked up to see a man she did not recognize walking through the door. He was tall, with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that curled slightly at the collar of his worn cotton shirt. His boots were dusty from riding, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own body. When he removed his hat, she saw eyes the color of a summer sky and a face that was handsome in a rugged, lived-in way. "Afternoon," he said, his voice carrying a slight drawl that marked him as someone from further south, perhaps Texas or Arizona territory. "I am looking for some leather oil and a few other supplies. Just rode in this morning. Welcome to Stockton. I can help you find what you need." Harriet kept her voice carefully neutral as she guided him toward the section where they kept leather goods and maintenance supplies. "Are you passing through or staying?" "Staying, looks like. Just got hired on at the Crawford Ranch about 10 miles east of here. I am Cade Ingram." He offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Harriet shook it. His grip was firm and warm, calloused from hard work. "Harriet Norton. I work here at Morrison's. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Norton." He picked up a tin of leather oil, examining it before setting it on the counter. "I will need a few other things, too. Some tobacco, coffee, and I saw you had some ready-made shirts in the window. I could use a couple of those." As Harriet helped him gather his purchases, she found herself hyper-aware of his presence, the way he moved through the space, the low rumble of his voice when he spoke. He was polite, friendly without being forward, and he had a way of looking at her when she talked that made her feel actually seen, not just tolerated. It was unsettling in its pleasantness. "You are not from California originally," Cade observed as she tallied up his purchases. It was not quite a question, more an invitation to share if she chose. Harriet's stomach clenched. "No, I came here last year. I figured as much. I am from Texas myself, but I have been moving around for a while now. Sometimes a change of scenery is good for a person." He said it easily, without prying, and Harriet felt some of her tension ease. Yes, exactly. He paid for his goods, loading them into the canvas bag he had brought with him. "I imagine I will be back in town fairly regularly for supplies and such. It was nice meeting you, Miss Norton." "You as well, Mr. Ingram." After he left, Harriet found her thoughts returning to him throughout the rest of the afternoon. There had been something open and genuine in his manner, something that made her wish, just for a moment, that she could talk to him in her real voice, tell him where she really came from. But of course, that was impossible. She had worked too hard to build this new identity to risk it now. That evening, as Harriet walked back to her boarding house on Oak Street, she noticed Cade Ingram again, standing outside the Silver Dollar Saloon talking to a couple of other ranch hands. He saw her and tipped his hat in greeting, and she nodded back before hurrying on her way. Mrs. Chen, who ran the boarding house, had dinner ready when Harriet arrived, and she ate with the 3 other residents, a widow named Mrs. Fletcher and 2 young men who worked for the railroad. The conversation flowed around her, but Harriet found herself distant from it, her mind caught between the letter from her sister and the memory of blue eyes and a genuine smile. The next few weeks fell into a familiar rhythm. Harriet worked 6 days a week at Morrison's, attended church on Sundays more for appearance than faith, and spent her evenings reading or doing mending in her room. Cade Ingram came into the store every week or so, always friendly, always polite, and Harriet found herself looking forward to those visits more than she wanted to admit. He never pressed her for personal information, but he shared bits of his own story, how he had left Texas after his parents' ranch was foreclosed on, how he had worked his way west through a series of ranch jobs, how he loved the open country and the work despite its hardships. One Saturday in June, Cade came in looking troubled, a purple bruise blooming along his jaw. Harriet could not help her reaction, the concern that flashed across her face before she could school it into polite neutrality. What happened? Disagreement with another hand at the ranch. Nothing serious, but Mr. Crawford decided it was best to let the other fellow go. Makes us short-handed for the cattle drive next week, though. He picked up a bar of soap, turning it over in his hands. How have you been, Miss Norton? You look tired, if you do not mind me saying. I am well enough. Just busy. In truth, she was exhausted. The constant vigilance required to maintain her false accent was wearing on her, and lately she had been catching herself slipping when she was alone, letting her real voice emerge in the privacy of her room. If you ever want to take a walk sometime, get some air. I would be happy for the company, Cade said, and there was something in his tone that made it clear this was more than just a friendly offer. Harriet's heart jumped, pleasure and panic mixing together. I do not know if that would be appropriate. Just a walk. Nothing improper. Maybe tomorrow after church. There is a nice path along the river that I heard about. She knew she should say no. Getting close to anyone meant risking exposure, meant the possibility that her careful facade would crack. But she found herself nodding anyway, drawn by something in his manner, by the kindness in his eyes. Tomorrow afternoon would be fine. Sunday dawned bright and hot, the kind of California summer day where the air shimmered, and even the lizards seemed to move slowly. Harriet wore her better dress, a dark green calico with a white collar, and took extra care with her hair, pinning it up in a neat bun. At church, she sat in her usual pew near the back and tried to focus on Reverend Thompson's sermon about patience and faith, but her mind kept wandering to the afternoon ahead. Cade was waiting outside her boarding house at 2 o'clock, freshly shaved and wearing clean clothes. They walked through town toward the river, not talking much at first, just enjoying the slight breeze that came off the water. Stockton was relatively quiet on Sunday afternoons, most people resting at home or visiting with friends. The path along the San Joaquin River was shaded by cottonwood trees, and the sound of the flowing water was soothing after the dusty stillness of town. "This is nice," Harriet said, relaxing slightly as they left the buildings behind. "I do not get out here much." "You work too hard," Cade observed. "Everyone needs time to rest. Some of us cannot afford much rest, fair enough, but even a few hours here and there helps." He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Can I ask you something? And you can tell me it is none of my business if you want." Harriet tensed. "What is it? Why do you seem so guarded all the time? Like you are always expecting something bad to happen?" The question hit closer to home than he could know. Harriet kept her eyes on the path ahead, choosing her words carefully. "I suppose I learned to be cautious. The world is not always kind to women on their own." "That is true enough." They walked in silence for a few minutes before Cade spoke again. "My mother used to say that carrying heavy things too long makes you forget how to put them down." I always thought that was just about farm work, but I have been thinking lately it might mean other things too. Your mother sounds wise. She was. I miss her. The simple honesty of it, the lack of embarrassment at admitting emotion, made something crack in Harriet's carefully constructed walls. They reached a spot where a large fallen log provided a natural bench overlooking the water. Cade gestured to it, and they sat, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough that Harriet could smell the soap he had used, the clean scent of cotton dried in the sun. "Tell me about Texas," she said, wanting to shift the focus away from herself. Cade did, painting pictures with his words of endless prairies and massive skies, of cattle drives and roundups, of the hard work and the simple satisfaction of a job well done. He talked about missing his home but knowing he could never go back, not with the ranch gone and his family scattered. Harriet listened, recognizing in his story echoes of her own loss and displacement. "You ever wish you could go back?" she asked, "even knowing everything has changed?" "Sometimes, but mostly I think we have to make new homes where we are, no point in living in the past." He turned to look at her directly. "What about you? Do you miss where you came from?" Every single day, Harriet thought, but what she said was, "Sometimes." "But you are right. We have to move forward." They sat by the river for another hour, talking about lighter things, books they had read and places they wanted to see. Cade had a dry sense of humor that surprised her into genuine laughter several times, and Harriet found herself more relaxed than she had been in months. When they finally walked back toward town, the sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. "I enjoyed this," Cade said as they reached her boarding house. "Could we do it again sometime?" "I would like that." His smile was warm and genuine. "Next Sunday then. If the weather holds, next Sunday." Harriet watched him walk away, his long stride easy and unhurried, and allowed herself a moment of pure, uncomplicated happiness. Then she went inside, returning to the careful performance of her daily life. The weeks that followed developed a pattern. Cade would come into Morrison's once or twice during the week for small supplies, always making time to chat with Harriet if the store was not too busy. On Sundays, they would walk by the river, gradually sharing more of themselves, building a friendship that was slowly transforming into something deeper. Harriet found herself thinking about him constantly, looking forward to their conversations, replaying things he had said in quiet moments. But the strain of maintaining her false accent was becoming harder. The more comfortable she became with Cade, the more she wanted to let her guard down completely, and the effort of preventing that was exhausting. She started making small mistakes, letting occasional words slip out in her natural voice when she was tired or distracted. So far, no one seemed to notice, but Harriet lived in fear that someone would hear, would call her out, would expose her as a fraud and an Irish immigrant trying to hide her origins. In late July, a new family moved to Stockton, the Donnellys, and Harriet knew from the moment she heard their thick Irish brogues in Morrison's that they were going to be a problem. Not because they were bad people, but because their presence highlighted everything she was trying to hide. Mrs. Donnelly came into the store one afternoon with her 3 children, and Harriet felt sweat break out along her spine as she listened to the woman's familiar accent, the rolling cadence that matched her own suppressed speech patterns. "Good afternoon," Harriet said in her careful, flat voice. "How can I help you?" Mrs. Donnelly looked at her curiously. "We are new in town and needing to stock up on some basics. Just arrived from Chicago yesterday." As Harriet helped them gather their purchases, she was acutely aware of Mrs. Donnelly studying her, a puzzled expression on her face. The children ran around the store, their excited chatter full of the same rhythms and inflections that Harriet had worked so hard to eliminate from her own speech. "Have we met before?" Mrs. Donnelly asked finally. "There is something familiar about you." "I do not think so. I have been in Stockton for nearly a year, but I came from back east." "So did we, originally. From County Cork before we went to Chicago. Where are your people from?" The direct question made Harriet's throat tighten. "My family is from New England." It was not technically a lie, but it felt like one, and Mrs. Donnelly's expression suggested she did not quite believe it. Before the conversation could continue, Mr. Morrison returned from his lunch break, and Harriet excused herself to help him with the account books. When she looked up again, the Donnellys were gone, and she released a breath she had not realized she was holding. That Sunday, Harriet was quieter than usual during her walk with Cade. He noticed, of course, and after a while he asked gently what was bothering her. "Just tired, I suppose." "You say that a lot." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression concerned. "Harriet, is something wrong, really wrong? Because if someone is bothering you or if you are in some kind of trouble, I would like to help if I can." The genuine care in his voice made her eyes burn with unshed tears. She looked away, focusing on the river flowing past. "There is nothing wrong exactly. I am just trying to figure some things out." "Well, when you are ready to talk about it, I am here to listen. No judgment, I promise." That promise almost undid her. She wanted so badly to believe it, to trust that he would accept her fully if she revealed the truth. But the fear was too deeply ingrained. She had seen too much prejudice, heard too many slurs, experienced too much rejection to risk it all on the hope that this man might be different. "Thank you," she managed to say. "That means a great deal." They continued their walk, but the ease between them felt slightly strained, and Harriet hated herself for creating that distance. When Cade left her at the boarding house that evening, he squeezed her hand gently before letting go, and that simple gesture of affection stayed with her through the long, sleepless night that followed. August brought scorching heat and short tempers to Stockton. The river ran lower, the dust thickened on the streets, and everyone seemed irritable and uncomfortable. At Morrison's, business slowed as people tried to avoid going out in the worst heat of the day. Harriet spent long hours in the dim interior of the store, grateful for the relative coolness, but feeling increasingly trapped by the walls of her deception. Cade came in one Wednesday afternoon looking dusty and worn out. "Just got back from a 3-day cattle drive to Sacramento. I swear I have eaten half the dust in California. You look like you could use a cold drink and a bath," Harriet said, allowing herself a small smile. "Both are high on my list, but I wanted to stop by and see you first." He lowered his voice, glancing around to make sure they were alone in the store. "There is a barn dance next Saturday night at the Crawford Ranch. Would you do me the honor of attending with me?" Harriet's first instinct was to say no. Public events meant more people, more chances to slip up, more opportunities for her carefully constructed identity to crack. But she was so tired of saying no to life, to connection, to the possibility of happiness. "I would love to," she heard herself say. Cade's face lit up with a grin that made him look years younger. "Wonderful. I will come get you at 6. There will be plenty of other folks from town there, so it will all be respectable and proper." After he left, Harriet stood behind the counter and tried to calm her racing heart. She was going to a dance with Cade Ingram. She was going to spend an entire evening with him in public, surrounded by people. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The next few days were a blur of nervous anticipation. Harriet washed and pressed her best dress, a light blue cotton with delicate white embroidery on the collar. Mrs. Chen helped her style her hair, pinning it up with a few soft curls framing her face. When Saturday evening arrived and Cade knocked on the boarding house door, Harriet took a deep breath, checked her reflection one last time, and went downstairs to meet him. The look on his face when he saw her made every moment of anxiety worth it. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm. They rode to the Crawford Ranch in a borrowed wagon, joining the stream of other townspeople heading to the dance. The ranch was about 10 miles outside of Stockton, a sprawling property with a large barn that had been cleared out and decorated for the occasion. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm light over the scene, and a small group of musicians were tuning their instruments in one corner. Long tables along the walls held food and drinks, and people milled about, chatting and laughing in the pleasant evening air. Cade introduced Harriet to some of the other ranch hands and their wives or sweethearts, and she nodded and smiled and spoke as little as possible, terrified of saying too much or letting her accent slip. When the music started, Cade led her onto the dance floor, his hand warm on her waist, and for a while, Harriet forgot to be afraid. She let herself get lost in the rhythm, in the feeling of moving with him, in the simple joy of being young and alive on a summer night. They danced several songs before taking a break to get some refreshments. As they stood by the punch bowl, Mrs. Donnelly appeared at Harriet's elbow with her husband in tow. "Harriet Norton, is it not? From Morrison's store. I am Catherine Donnelly, and this is my husband Patrick. We met a few weeks back. Yes, hello, this is Cade Ingram." The men shook hands and Patrick clapped Cade on the shoulder. "Any man working the Crawford Ranch is doing honest work. Good to meet you." "Likewise," Cade said warmly. Catherine was studying Harriet again with that same curious expression. "You know, I could swear I hear something in your voice, something familiar. My husband thinks I am imagining things, but I grew up in Cork and I know the sound of home when I hear it." Harriet felt the blood drain from her face. Beside her, she felt Cade tense, picking up on her distress. "I am from Boston originally," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Perhaps you are hearing some New England influence." "Perhaps," Catherine said, but she did not sound convinced. "Well, it was lovely to see you again. Enjoy the dance." As the Donnellys moved away, Harriet felt the room closing in on her. The heat, the noise, the press of bodies all became too much. "I need some air," she said to Cade, and hurried outside before he could respond. The night air was cooler, and Harriet walked away from the barn, toward the corral where horses stood dozing in the moonlight. She pressed her hands to her hot cheeks, trying to steady her breathing, trying to calm the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She heard footsteps behind her and knew without turning that it was Cade. "Harriet, what is going on?" "Nothing, I just needed a moment." "That is not nothing. You looked like you were about to faint in there." He came to stand beside her, not touching but close enough that she could feel his presence. "Does this have something to do with Mrs. Donnelly? With what she said about your voice?" The gentleness in his tone broke something loose inside Harriet. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the constant fear all came crashing down at once. "I cannot do this anymore," she whispered. "I am so tired of lying." "Then stop lying," Cade said simply. "Tell me the truth. Whatever it is, it cannot be as bad as you think." Harriet turned to face him, and in the moonlight she could see his expression, open and concerned and free of judgment. She took a shaky breath and made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. "I am Irish," she said, and this time she let the words come out in her real voice, with all the rolling brogue she had been suppressing for months. "I was born in County Galway and came to America when I was 8 years old. My family settled in Boston, and after my parents died last year, I came to California hoping for a fresh start. But everywhere I went, people looked down on the Irish, would not hire us, would not rent to us, called us names and treated us like we were less than human. So I decided to hide it. I taught myself to talk differently, to sound American, and it worked. I got the job at Morrison's, found a place to live, and people treated me like I was acceptable. But it has been killing me, Cade. Every day I have to pretend to be someone I am not, and I am so tired of it. And now Mrs. Donnelly is going to figure it out and tell everyone, and I will lose everything all over again. The words poured out of her in a rush, her real accent growing stronger with each sentence, and when she finished, she was crying, tears streaming down her face. She waited for him to step back, to look at her with disgust or disappointment, to tell her that she had deceived him, and he wanted nothing more to do with her. Instead, he reached out and gently cupped her face with both hands, using his thumbs to wipe away her tears. "Is that all?" he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look up at him in confusion. "Is that all? Cade, I have been lying to you since the day we met." "You have been protecting yourself," he corrected. "And I understand why, even though I wish you had not felt you needed to. Harriet, I do not care where you were born or how you talk. Actually, that is not true. I love the way you speak. Your real voice is beautiful. It is warm and musical, and it sounds like you, the real you, not the person you have been forcing yourself to be." Harriet stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "You do not mind that I am Irish. Why would I mind? My best friend growing up was Patrick O'Malley, and my mother's maiden name was Murphy. I have got Irish blood in me too, a few generations back. And even if I did not, it would not matter. I like you, Harriet, the real you. I have been able to tell for weeks that you were hiding something, that you were not letting yourself be fully present. And it has been frustrating, because I could see glimpses of this amazing woman underneath all the caution. This woman right here, talking to me in her real voice, this is who I want to know. I thought you would be disgusted. Never." He said it with such certainty that something tight and painful in Harriet's chest began to loosen. "Listen, I know what it is like to be judged for things you cannot control. I know what it is like to have to start over and prove yourself, and I know how much courage it takes to be honest about who you really are. So thank you for trusting me with this." Harriet let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding through her. "I have been so afraid. I know, but you do not have to be afraid anymore, at least not with me." He smiled, still holding her face gently. "Will you tell me more about Ireland, about your family? I want to hear all of it, in your real voice." They sat on the corral fence and talked for over an hour, Harriet sharing stories from her childhood, memories of green hills and stone walls and the sound of the ocean. She told him about her parents, her siblings, the passage across the Atlantic, and the harsh reality of immigrant life in Boston. She talked about the discrimination she had faced, the doors slammed in her face, the casual cruelty of people who viewed the Irish as inferior. And Cade listened to all of it, asking questions, expressing outrage on her behalf, and never once making her feel like her experiences were not valid or important. "What are you going to do now?" he asked finally. "About Morrison's, about the town. I do not know. Maybe nothing changes. Maybe I keep speaking the way I have been in public and save my real voice for private moments. Or maybe you stop hiding," Cade suggested. "Maybe you speak naturally and let people think what they want. You are good at your job. Mr. Morrison would be a fool to let you go just because of an accent, and anyone who would treat you badly for something so insignificant is not worth your concern." That is easy to say. I know, and I am not saying it would not be hard. But I will be right there with you if you want me to be. I will make it clear that anyone who disrespects you will have to answer to me. The fierce protectiveness in his voice made Harriet's heart swell. She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. How did I get so lucky to meet you? I think I am the lucky one." He lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender that it made Harriet's breath catch. "Can I be honest about something? Always. I have been falling for you since the first day I walked into Morrison's. There was something about you that drew me in, even when you were holding yourself back. And now, seeing you like this, hearing your real voice, knowing the truth about who you are and what you have been through, I am completely lost. I am in love with you, Harriet Norton." The declaration hung in the air between them, huge and terrifying and wonderful. Harriet felt like her heart might burst from her chest. "I love you too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have been trying not to, trying to protect myself, but I cannot help it. I love you, Cade Ingram." He pulled her close and kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Harriet felt like she was finally coming home after a long, exhausting journey. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, Cade rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably go back to the dance before people start talking." "Let them talk," Harriet said recklessly, and Cade laughed, the sound warm and delighted. They did return to the barn hand in hand and danced the rest of the evening away. Harriet caught Mrs. Donnelly watching them once or twice, a knowing smile on her face, but for the first time, Harriet did not care. She was tired of being afraid, tired of hiding, tired of making herself smaller to fit into other people's narrow expectations. The ride back to town that night was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts but comfortable in the silence. When Cade walked Harriet to the door of the boarding house, he kissed her again, longer this time, and made her promise to meet him the next day so they could talk more about what came next. That night, lying in her bed, Harriet replayed the evening in her mind. The moment of truth, the fear, and then the overwhelming relief of being accepted, of being loved for who she really was. It seemed impossible that after all her worry and planning and careful performance, the solution had been as simple as honesty. But she knew it was not really that simple. Cade was one person, one wonderfully open-minded and kind person. The rest of the town might not be so accepting. The next morning, Harriet made a decision. She dressed carefully, pinned her hair up, and walked to Morrison's general store with her spine straight and her chin up. When Mr. Morrison arrived to open up, she asked to speak with him privately. "Is something wrong, Miss Norton?" "Not wrong exactly, sir, but there is something I need to tell you. I have not been entirely honest about my background, and it does not feel right to continue the deception." She took a breath and continued in her natural voice, letting the Irish accent come through clearly. "I am from Ireland originally, sir. I came to America as a child and lived in Boston before moving here. I have been hiding my accent because I was afraid of losing my job, but I realize now that was not fair to you or to me." Mr. Morrison blinked at her in surprise, clearly processing this information. He was a fair man in his 50s, balding and portly, who ran his store with efficiency and a certain gruff kindness. After a long moment he spoke. "I appreciate your honesty, Miss Norton. I will admit this is unexpected, but you have been an excellent employee. You are punctual, reliable, good with customers, and you keep excellent accounts. I see no reason why your accent should change any of that. If it becomes a problem with customers, we will address it then. But for now, consider the matter settled." The relief that washed over Harriet was almost dizzying. "Thank you, sir. You do not know what this means to me. I think I have some idea. My own grandfather came from Germany and faced similar prejudices. Everyone in this country came from somewhere else, unless they were here first. Seems foolish to spend so much time judging each other over it." He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the philosophical turn the conversation had taken. Now, shall we open the store? Those shelves will not stock themselves. The first real test came later that morning when Mrs. Pritchard came in for her weekly shopping. Harriet greeted her in her natural voice, and the woman's eyes widened in surprise. "Goodness, Miss Norton, you sound different today. Are you ill?" "No, madam. This is actually how I normally speak. I am from Ireland originally." Mrs. Pritchard's expression cycled through several emotions, surprise giving way to confusion and then settling into a sort of disdainful disapproval. "I see. How interesting that you failed to mention that before. I was concerned about prejudice, madam." "Prejudice? Well, I suppose there are reasons for certain attitudes." Mrs. Pritchard sniffed. "I will need the usual items, if you please." Harriet served her with professional courtesy, refusing to let the woman's coldness affect her. When Mrs. Pritchard left, she held her head high, and if her hands shook slightly as she recorded the sale in the ledger, no one was there to see it. The rest of the day brought mixed reactions. Some customers seemed not to notice or care about the change in her accent. Others looked surprised but said nothing. A few, like Mrs. Pritchard, made their disapproval clear through tone and manner if not through direct words. By the time Harriet closed the store that evening, she was exhausted but also oddly liberated. She had done it. She had stopped hiding and the world had not ended. Cade was waiting outside when she locked the door. "How did it go?" "Mixed, but I survived." "That is my girl." He offered his arm and they walked toward the river, falling into their familiar pattern. "I talked to Mr. Crawford today. Asked if there might be a small cabin on the ranch property that could be fixed up. He said there is an old line shack about a mile from the main house that needs work, but is structurally sound. I am thinking if I fix it up, make it livable, maybe it could be a home for us, eventually." Harriet stopped walking and turned to face him. "Cade Ingram, are you proposing to me?" He grinned, looking boyish and hopeful. "Not yet. I figure we should court properly for a while first. But I wanted you to know that I am serious about this, about us. I want a future with you, Harriet. I want to marry you and build a life together." "I want that too," Harriet said, her heart full to bursting. "More than anything." The next few months were a whirlwind of change and adjustment. Harriet continued to speak in her natural accent, and while some townspeople remained cool toward her, many others did not seem to care. The Donnellys became friendly, grateful to have someone else Irish to talk to, and Catherine often stopped by the store to chat. Harriet found herself forming real friendships for the first time since arriving in Stockton. Connections based on honesty rather than pretense. Cade worked on fixing up the line shack in his spare time, and on Sundays, Harriet would ride out to the ranch with him and help with the work. They painted walls, mended the roof, built furniture from scrap lumber, and slowly transformed the small cabin into a cozy home. As they worked side by side, they talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's habits and preferences, building the foundation of a life together. In September, Cade officially proposed. He took Harriet back to the spot by the river where they had first walked together, got down on one knee in the soft grass, and offered her a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. "Harriet Norton, you are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever met. You make me want to be a better man. Will you marry me?" Through tears of joy, Harriet said yes. They were married in October, a small ceremony at the church with the Donnellys and a few other friends in attendance. Mr. Morrison gave Harriet the day off and even attended the wedding himself, bringing a set of dishes as a gift. Harriet wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, with lace borrowed from Mrs. Chen, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Cade had picked that morning. When Reverend Thompson asked if she took this man to be her lawfully wedded husband, Harriet said, "I do," in her clear Irish accent, and felt nothing but pride and happiness. The reception was held at the Crawford Ranch, and this time when Harriet danced, she did not worry about what people thought or whether she was saying the right things in the right way. She laughed freely, spoke openly, and let herself be fully present in the joy of the day. Cade never left her side except when dancing with Mrs. Crawford out of politeness, and he kept looking at her with such love and wonder that Harriet felt like the luckiest woman in the world. That night, they moved into their finished cabin, and Harriet stood in the doorway looking at the space they had created together. It was small and simple, but it was theirs, built on honesty and love and the courage to be themselves. Cade came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Welcome home, Mrs. Ingram." "It is perfect," Harriet whispered, leaning back into his embrace. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. Money was tight on a ranch hand's wages, and there were times when they had to choose between necessities. The work was hard, the hours long, and the California heat could be brutal. But through it all they had each other, and that made everything bearable. Harriet continued to work at Morrison's 3 days a week, contributing her wages to their savings. The other days she spent taking care of their home, tending a small garden, and helping out at the ranch house when Mrs. Crawford needed an extra pair of hands. She became close with several of the other ranch wives, women who admired her work ethic and gradually came to accept her accent and her background. There were still incidents of prejudice. A traveling salesman refused to deal with Harriet because of her accent, insisting on speaking only to Mr. Morrison. A few of the more prominent town families made it clear that the Ingrams were not welcome at certain social events. But these snubs hurt less than they might have before, because Harriet had built a community of people who valued her for who she was. She had the Donnellys, the ranch families, Mr. Morrison, and most importantly, she had Cade. In the spring of 1879, Harriet discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror. She had watched her own mother die young, worn out by poverty and hard work and too many pregnancies. She knew the dangers of childbirth, especially in a rural area far from good medical care. But when she told Cade, his face lit up with such pure happiness that her fears receded, replaced by cautious excitement. "We are going to be parents," he said, placing his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "I am going to be a father. Are you ready for this?" "Probably not, but I cannot wait to try." He pulled her close, holding her carefully as if she might break. "I promise I will take care of you both, whatever you need, whatever I have to do." Harriet's pregnancy was relatively easy, though the summer heat made her uncomfortable and tired. Cade took on extra work to save money for the baby, and Harriet cut back her hours at Morrison's as she grew larger. The women of the community rallied around her, bringing food and baby clothes, sharing advice and stories from their own experiences. Catherine Donnelly was particularly helpful, having had 4 children of her own, and she promised to be there for the birth. In November, on a clear, cold night, Harriet went into labor. Cade rode frantically into town to fetch Catherine and the midwife, Mrs. Anderson, while Harriet tried to stay calm through the increasing waves of pain. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, and there were moments when Harriet thought she might not survive it. But Catherine held her hand and talked her through each contraction, and Mrs. Anderson was skilled and experienced, and finally, as dawn broke over the ranch, Harriet gave birth to a healthy baby girl. When Mrs. Anderson placed the baby in her arms, Harriet looked down at the tiny, perfect face and felt a love so overwhelming it brought tears to her eyes. Cade, who had been pacing anxiously outside, was allowed in to meet his daughter, and when he saw her, he actually cried, tears streaming down his weathered face. "She is beautiful," he whispered, touching one tiny hand with his finger. "She looks just like you." "We should name her Mary, after your mother," Harriet said, remembering the stories Cade had told her about the woman who had raised him with such love and wisdom. "Mary Catherine Ingram," Cade said, glancing at Catherine Donnelly with gratitude. "After both the strong women who made this possible." Mary was a good baby, healthy and generally content, though she had a powerful set of lungs when she wanted to make her needs known. Harriet threw herself into motherhood with the same determination. She brought to everything else, learning to nurse and soothe and care for this tiny person who depended on her completely. Cade was a devoted father, coming home from long days of ranch work to hold his daughter and sing to her in his off-key voice, telling her stories and making promises about the life they would give her. As Mary grew from infant to toddler, Harriet watched her with a mixture of love and fierce protectiveness. She was determined that her daughter would grow up knowing her heritage, proud of her Irish roots, never ashamed of where she came from. She taught Mary songs from her own childhood, told her stories about Ireland and Boston, and spoke to her in her natural accent so that the child grew up hearing both her parents' voices in their authentic form. When Mary was 2, Harriet found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was harder, complicated by nausea and exhaustion that lasted throughout. But in the summer of 1882, she gave birth to a son, a healthy boy with Cade's blue eyes and a shock of dark hair. They named him Thomas, after Harriet's brother who was still somewhere on the Atlantic fishing boats. With 2 children and a household to manage, Harriet had to stop working at Morrison's entirely. She missed the social interaction and the independence of earning her own money, but she threw herself into her new role with characteristic determination. She kept house, tended the garden, cared for the children, and helped Cade when he needed it. The work was endless and often exhausting, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way her previous life never had been. Life settled into a rhythm over the next few years. Cade was promoted to foreman at the Crawford Ranch, which came with a modest raise and a bit more security. They were able to expand the cabin, adding another room for the children and a proper kitchen for Harriet. Mary started school in town, riding in each day with one of the other ranch families, and proved to be a bright, curious student. Thomas grew into a rambunctious toddler who kept Harriet constantly on her toes. Through it all, Harriet never forgot those months of hiding her true self, the exhaustion and loneliness of living behind a mask. She made a point of being open about her background, and she raised her children to be proud of their mixed heritage, both Irish and American, both immigrant and native-born. She taught them that honesty and courage were more important than fitting in, that being true to yourself was worth any temporary discomfort. In 1884, Harriet received a letter from her sister Margaret saying she was planning to visit California with her family. The reunion, when it finally happened that fall, was tearful and joyful. Margaret barely recognized Harriet at first, so changed was she from the frightened young woman who had left Boston 7 years earlier. But when Harriet spoke in her natural accent that she no longer tried to hide, Margaret burst into tears. "You sound like yourself again, like home." "I am home," Harriet said, gesturing to Cade and the children, to the cabin and the land around them. "This is where I belong." Margaret stayed for 3 weeks, and during that time, the sisters talked for hours, catching up on all the years they had been apart. Margaret told stories of New York, of her husband's work, of her own children growing up in the city. Harriet shared her journey, the struggles and the triumphs, the moment when she stopped hiding and started living authentically. When Margaret finally left to return east, she hugged Harriet tightly and whispered, "I am so proud of you. Mama and Papa would be too." The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows. Mr. Morrison retired and sold the store to a younger man who kept Harriet on as a part-time bookkeeper once Thomas started school. Catherine Donnelly's husband Patrick died in a farm accident, and Harriet was there to support her friend through the grief. The Crawford Ranch prospered, and Cade's position became more secure. Mary grew into a smart, independent young woman who talked about becoming a teacher. Thomas proved to have a gift with horses and spent every spare moment at the stables. In 1889, when Harriet was 31 years old and had been in California for 12 years, she stood in the yard of their expanded cabin and watched Cade teaching Thomas how to rope a fence post while Mary read under a tree nearby. The evening sun painted everything gold, and Harriet felt a profound sense of contentment wash over her. This life, this family, this place where she could be fully herself without fear or shame. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for back in those early days of hiding and pretending. Cade looked up and caught her watching, and his face broke into the smile that still made her heart skip after all these years. He handed the rope to Thomas and walked over to her, sliding an arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "Just remembering," Harriet said, leaning into his embrace. "Remembering how afraid I was, how sure I was that no one could love the real me. And then you came along and proved me wrong. Best thing I ever did was walk into Morrison's that day." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I love you, Harriet Ingram. Every part of you, including and especially that beautiful accent. I love you too, more than I can say." They stood there together, watching their children, and Harriet thought about all the paths not taken, all the alternate lives she might have lived if she had kept hiding, kept pretending, kept making herself smaller to fit into other people's expectations. She was grateful beyond words that she had found the courage to stop, to be honest, to trust that love was possible even for someone with an Irish brogue and an immigrant past. Over the next decade, Harriet watched her children grow into adults who made her proud. Mary did become a teacher, taking a position at the Stockton schoolhouse and earning respect for her dedication and skill. She fell in love with a young lawyer named James Fletcher, whose family had initially expressed concerns about his marrying the daughter of a ranch foreman and an Irish immigrant. But Mary had inherited her mother's strength and her father's steadiness, and she made it clear that anyone who could not accept her family was not worthy of her. James, to his credit, stood by her, and his family eventually came around. The wedding in 1893 was a large, joyful affair that brought together all the diverse strands of Harriet's California life. Thomas, meanwhile, stayed on at the Crawford Ranch, working alongside his father and showing real talent for both the practical work of ranching and the business side of running the operation. When old Mr. Crawford died in 1895, his son Robert took over the ranch and made Thomas assistant foreman, a position of real responsibility for someone only 24 years old. Thomas married a rancher's daughter named Sarah Mitchell, and they moved into their own small house on the property, starting the next generation of Ingrams in California. As Harriet entered her 40s, she found herself in a position she never would have imagined in those early days of hiding her accent in town. She was respected, even admired, in the community. People came to her for advice, for help, for her perspective on both practical matters and personal problems. The fact that she spoke with an Irish accent was simply accepted as part of who she was, unremarkable after so many years. The prejudices that had seemed so insurmountable when she first arrived had not disappeared exactly, but they had faded enough that Harriet could live her life without constant fear. In 1897, a new wave of Irish immigrants arrived in Stockton, fleeing continued hardship in their homeland. Many in the town were hostile to these newcomers, viewing them with the same suspicion and contempt that Harriet had faced 20 years earlier. But this time, Harriet was in a position to help. She worked with the Donnellys and a few other Irish families to create a sort of informal aid society, helping the new arrivals find housing and work, teaching them how to navigate the systems and prejudices they would face, and offering them something even more valuable, the knowledge that they were not alone. One young woman in particular reminded Harriet powerfully of her younger self. Her name was Bridget O'Connor, and she was 21 years old, fresh from County Mayo with her thick accent and her fierce determination to make a better life. Harriet took Bridget under her wing, giving her work helping with the household and the garden, teaching her about California and its ways, and most importantly, encouraging her to be proud of who she was. "Do not hide your voice," Harriet told her one afternoon as they worked together in the garden. "I did that for months when I first came here, and it nearly broke me. Yes, some people will judge you for how you speak, but the people who matter, the people worth knowing, they will see past that to who you really are." "You make it sound so easy," Bridget said, her accent even thicker than Harriet's had ever been. "It is not easy, but it is necessary. You cannot build a real life on a foundation of lies and fear. Trust me, I learned that the hard way." Bridget took the advice to heart, and Harriet watched with satisfaction as the young woman gradually built a life in Stockton, speaking in her natural voice and finding acceptance among the community. When Bridget eventually married one of the ranch hands and started her own family, she told Harriet that she did not know what she would have done without her guidance and support. "You gave me the courage to be myself," Bridget said. "That is a gift I can never repay." "Then pass it on," Harriet said simply. "Help the next person who needs it. That is payment enough." As the century drew to a close, Harriet found herself reflecting more and more on the journey she had taken. From the frightened young woman hiding her accent in a dusty general store to the woman she had become, confident and respected and surrounded by love, the transformation seemed almost impossible. But it had happened, one small brave choice at a time, starting with the decision to trust Cade with the truth about who she really was. In the spring of 1900, Harriet and Cade celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. Their children organized a party at the ranch, inviting everyone who had been part of their lives over the years. As Harriet looked around at the gathered crowd, the friends and family and community they had built, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. These were people who knew her fully, accent and all, who valued her for her character and her contributions, not for how well she could pretend to be someone else. Mary stood up to give a toast, her voice clear and strong. "To my parents, who taught me that courage means being true to yourself even when it is hard. Who showed me that real love means accepting someone completely, all their history and all their truth. Mama, Papa, thank you for the example you have set and the home you have built. Here is to 25 more years together." Everyone raised their glasses, and Harriet felt tears pricking her eyes. Cade reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently, and she squeezed back, communicating without words all the love and gratitude that filled her heart. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and the children had left for their own houses, Harriet and Cade sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the stars come out in the vast California sky. Cade had his arm around her shoulders and Harriet leaned against him, tired but deeply content. "You ever regret it?" Cade asked quietly. "Leaving Boston, coming all the way out here, taking such a risk?" "Never. Not once." Harriet tilted her head to look up at him. "Everything I went through, all the fear and the struggle, it led me to you, to this life. How could I regret that? I am glad, because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Harriet Ingram, and you are mine. You gave me the courage to stop hiding, to be myself, and that changed everything. I love you, Cade. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other across the vastness of the American West, who had built a life on honesty and courage and love. The journey had not been easy, but it had been worth every difficult step. As Harriet drifted off to sleep that night, Cade's breathing steady and reassuring beside her, she thought about that younger version of herself, so afraid and so alone, convinced that she had to hide her true self to survive. If she could speak to that girl now, she would tell her to hold on, to have faith, to believe that somewhere out there was a person who would love her exactly as she was. A cowboy with blue eyes and a kind heart who would hear her real voice and say the words she had never dared hope to hear. "I love the way you speak." The next decade brought the inevitable changes that come with aging and the passage of time. Harriet's hair turned silver, and the hard work of a ranching life left its marks on both her and Cade's bodies. But they faced it together, adapting to each new limitation, finding ways to stay useful and engaged as they entered their 50s. Mary gave them 3 grandchildren, and Thomas and Sarah added 2 more, filling the ranch with the sound of young voices and laughter. Harriet threw herself into being a grandmother with the same intensity she brought to everything else, teaching the children songs and stories from her Irish childhood, making sure they knew where their family had come from and what it had taken to build the life they enjoyed. In 1908, when Harriet was 50 years old, she received word that her brother Thomas had finally retired from fishing and settled in Maine. He wrote that he had often thought of her over the years, wondering how her California adventure had turned out, and he wanted to reconnect. The correspondence that followed was a balm to Harriet's heart, one more piece of her fragmented past coming back together. Thomas even visited the next year, a weathered man in his late 40s who had spent most of his life on the ocean. He and Cade got along famously, 2 men who understood hard work and the satisfaction of a life well lived. "You did good, Hattie," Thomas said before he left. "Mama and Papa would be so proud of you. You took a chance and you made it work." "We all did what we had to do," Harriet replied. "You made your life on the sea, Margaret made hers in New York, and I made mine here. We survived, and that is what matters." As the years passed, Harriet became something of a local fixture in Stockton, known for her sharp mind, her generosity, and her willingness to speak hard truths when necessary. Young women, particularly immigrants, sought her out for advice and support. She became an unofficial mentor to dozens of newcomers, helping them navigate the challenges of building a life in a new place. And she always encouraged them to be true to themselves, to speak in their natural voices, to resist the pressure to hide or diminish who they were. In 1915, the world was changing rapidly, technology and politics transforming the landscape in ways that sometimes felt overwhelming. But on the Crawford Ranch, now run by Robert Crawford's sons, life continued in its familiar rhythms. Cade, now 63 years old, officially retired from his foreman position, though he still came around to help with training horses and advising on various matters. Harriet, at 57, finally had the time to pursue some of the interests she had set aside during the busy years of raising children and running a household. She took up painting, capturing on canvas the California landscapes she had grown to love, the golden hills and twisted oaks and endless skies. They traveled a bit too, taking the train to San Francisco to visit Margaret's daughter who had moved there, and even making one memorable trip back to Boston, so Harriet could see the places of her childhood one last time. Standing in the old neighborhood where she had grown up, now even more crowded and run down than she remembered, Harriet felt nothing but gratitude for the choice she had made to leave, to take a chance on California and the promise of something better. Their 50th wedding anniversary in 1925 was a grand affair, with children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren gathered to celebrate. Harriet, at 67, looked around at the assembled crowd and marveled at the family tree that had grown from that single brave decision she had made so many years ago to tell Cade the truth about who she was. Every person there, every life represented, was a testament to the power of honesty and courage. Mary, now a white-haired woman in her 40s with grown children of her own, stood to give a speech much as she had at the 25th anniversary. My parents taught me that love means seeing someone fully and choosing them anyway. Choosing them because of who they really are, not despite it. They have lived that truth for 50 years, and they have given all of us a model of what marriage, what partnership, what real love looks like. To Mama and Papa, 50 years and still going strong. The applause was thunderous and Harriet wiped tears from her eyes. Cade, 83 now but still sharp and present, kissed her softly and whispered in her ear, "Still the best decision I ever made." "Which decision?" "Telling you I loved the way you speak, making sure you knew you did not have to hide, not with me." Harriet laughed through her tears. That changed everything. It really did. As they moved into their twilight years, Harriet and Cade settled into a comfortable routine. They spent their days on the porch of their cabin, watching the grandchildren and great-grandchildren play, tending a small garden, and reminiscing about the long, full life they had shared. Harriet's Irish accent had never faded, and now it was simply part of the texture of her speech, neither hidden nor emphasized, just naturally present. Young people in the family sometimes asked her to tell stories about the old country, about the crossing, about the early days in California, and she obliged, painting pictures with her words of a world that was rapidly fading into history. In the summer of 1928, Cade fell ill with pneumonia. Despite the best efforts of doctors and the devoted care of his family, he did not recover. He died in early August with Harriet holding his hand, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. His last words were for Harriet, "I love you. Always have, always will. Every version of you, but especially the real one." "I love you too," Harriet whispered through her tears. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for everything." When he was gone, Harriet felt as though part of herself had been torn away. They had been together for 53 years, more than half her life, and she did not know how to exist without him. But she was not alone. Her family gathered around her, supporting her through the grief, and slowly, painfully, she learned to navigate this new reality. She lived for another 8 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1936 at the age of 78. By then, she had seen the world transform in ways she never could have imagined as a young woman arriving in California in 1877. But through all the changes, she had remained true to herself, speaking in her Irish accent, proud of her heritage, and grateful for the love that had made it all possible. At her funeral, attended by a huge crowd of family, friends, and community members whose lives she had touched over the decades, Mary told the story one more time. The story of a young woman who hid her accent out of fear, and the cowboy who told her he loved the way she spoke. The story of courage and honesty, and the transformative power of being truly seen and accepted. The story of a love that had spanned half a century and created a legacy that would live on for generations. "My mother taught me to be brave," Mary said, her voice strong despite her tears. "She taught me that hiding who you are is a kind of slow death, and that real life, real love, only begins when you have the courage to be yourself." She lived those values every single day, and she gave us all an example to follow. Harriet Norton Ingram was a woman of strength, integrity, and endless love. She will be deeply missed but never forgotten. As they laid Harriet to rest beside Cade on a hillside overlooking the ranch where they had built their life together, the sun broke through the clouds, painting the California landscape in shades of gold. It seemed fitting, a benediction on a life well lived, a love story that had begun with the simple revolutionary act of being honest about who you really are and finding someone who loved you for it. The Irish brogue that Harriet had once hidden in fear had become a cherished part of her legacy, passed down through the generations in songs and stories, and the proud knowledge of where the family had come from. Years later, when Harriet's great-grandchildren asked about her, they were told about the brave young woman who had come to California seeking a new life, who had almost lost herself trying to fit in, and who had found salvation in the form of a cowboy who saw her, really saw her, and loved what he found. They were told about the importance of honesty, of courage, of staying true to yourself even when the world pressures you to be someone else. And they were taught to be proud of their Irish heritage, to honor the woman who had given them all the gift of her bravery. The story of Harriet Norton and Cade Ingram became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations, a reminder that love, real love, requires and rewards authenticity. That hiding yourself might feel safer in the moment, but true happiness only comes when you have the courage to be fully seen. That sometimes, the most radical thing you can do is simply speak in your own voice and trust that the right people will love you for it. And somewhere, in the California earth where two lovers rested side by side after a lifetime together, the story lived on, eternal and unchanging. A tale of fear overcome and love discovered, of masks discarded and truth embraced, of an accent hidden and then celebrated, of a woman who found her voice and a man who loved the way she spoke. It was a story about the American West, about immigration and identity, about the courage it takes to build a new life in a strange land. But most of all, it was a love story, pure and simple, and like all the best love stories, it had a happy ending that lasted for generations.